The win against BYU was awesome, but it is time to transition mentally to focus on Washington State. And we begin today with what Oregon can do better, even after a blowout win against BYU last week. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view of the day if you're watching on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why, if you have not already, please continue to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Thank you to everybody out there who has already done so. And I would like to thank LinkedIn Jobs for being the official college football recruiting sponsor across the Locked On College Network. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Not just the terms, but the conditions as well. So it's game week. We are on hump day here as this episode is dropping, which means we're just a few days away. And every day of the week, I always think of in relation to how close it is to the next Oregon football game and the next college football Saturday, which is a grand and glorious time of year to be in the midst of, especially coming off of a big win for the Ducks against then 12th ranked BYU. They're up to number 15 in the AP poll nationally, which is right about where I thought they'd be. My prediction was 16. I don't know if I said that here on the show, but that's where I thought they would be at. And they're right around that range. And I think that that is appropriate. Speaking of rankings, we're playing a Washington State team this week that probably should be in the top 25. They're receiving votes. They're like right on the cusp. I think part of the reason they're not in is when you're the Cougars of Washington State in Pullman, Washington, you have to earn the respect of the AP voters a little bit more just because they don't have an incredibly rich program history. Me personally, I think they should probably be number 24 or number 25. Like, you went on the road, right? If not only for the premise of you should be rewarded for going on the road and beating a preseason ranked team. That should be enough. They're 3-0 coming into this one, feeling good after a blowout win against Colorado State, who's a terrible football team. Would they beat Colorado? We don't know. Probably not. That's where Colorado State is right now. But the Cougars did what they were supposed to in that particular game. But we want to focus on the Ducks and what they can do better. So a lot of things went right in that BYU game. And by a lot of things, I mean seemingly everything. The only turnover came from the backup quarterback. Oregon ran the ball well, didn't throw for a ton of yards. It looks like the staff does want to run the ball first. I mean, it was a pretty good balance statistically, run and pass. I loved the amount of explosion plays that were involved in the passing game, though, which was a really encouraging thing to see because of all the playmakers that are there. And Bo Nix, 12 completions, which is not a lot, to 8 different receivers, that is a lot. And that was a really good thing to see. The defense played well. They were disciplined. They played assignment football. They forced turnovers on downs, not regular turnovers. And that's something that, I'm not going to say they have to do this week, but you'd certainly like to see a turnover from the defense. Perhaps Cam Ward has been prone to throwing them at times in 2022. But the biggest thing that Oregon's got to get better at relating to Cam Ward is the pass rush. And overall in that BYU game, the defensive line played very well. BYU couldn't run the ball. And that's a BYU team that wants to run the ball, is capable of doing so, has the personnel to do that, and Oregon just didn't let them. And the unsung hero was Casey Rogers, but you got to give all those guys credit. Sam Taimani, Jordan Riley, the transfers who are seeing more action with Popo out. Brandon Dorlus was really good. I think it was probably the best defensive game for DJ Johnson, even though he didn't record a sack. And when we saw him in the spring game and he was exploding off the line, making plays, and he went, whoa, that looks like a different player. That was great to see that he was showing that sort of potential, that sort of explosiveness and athleticism. I mean, frankly, he looked kind of like an NFL player out there, and he has that sort of body. But he still did not register a sack, but it was nevertheless the best game I've seen from him. What he did exceptionally well in that game, and one of the reasons BYU did not run the football well, is he set the edge. And that defensive end position has now been labeled colloquially in football and officially, honestly, as an edge position, right? Those are some of the recruits that Oregon's looking at. Like Mateo Uyunglele is an edge, Samuel Mpemba, right? Guys that I've talked about in the previous weeks when discussing recruiting here on the show. That's why they're called edge players, because they have to be able to set the edge. And DJ Johnson did such a great job of doing that time and time again. Wasn't always getting credit, but he drew a holding penalty. He made plays on BYU's first drive. He stopped that run on 3rd and 10 for only a 3-yard gain, or else it might have been a 5 or 6 yard gain, which then makes it a much more manageable 4th down conversion rather than having to go on 4th and 7. If they make the same play call, it's the same result, of course. But he was just everywhere. And he made a tackle on 4th down, catching Jaron Hall from behind. And even though I would still like to see this team find a way to get more pressure on the quarterback, I was really impressed with the run defense and the way that they played their assignments well, and they were just physical at the point of attack. And that's something that you're going to have to do against this Washington State team that is not the Washington State team of old. They play a more physical brand of football than what you may think of when it comes to the Cougars. I've talked about this a lot on Locked On Pac-12. You can't think of this Washington State team under Jake Dickert, who was their defensive coordinator and is now their head coach after being the interim head coach and doing a really nice job. And he has now picked up the biggest win for Washington State literally in 4 years in his first full season. He's off to a really good start, but he is implementing his brand and style of football in Washington State. Now, they will still throw it around, right? 38 points against Colorado State. It's not a great opponent. It's honestly not a great points total. They only put up 24 against Idaho at home in their season opener. That's an FCS opponent. And, the fact they put up 38 last week means their offense probably starting to click a little bit more. But they only scored 17 points at Camp Randall, right? That game was won with their defense. And when you think about Washington State and what makes them a tough opponent, is it that their defense is really good? Probably not. But our perception of them has to change. They've got a defensive head coach, and their team is taking on that personality. And they play a much more physical brand of football than what they did when Mike Leach was there. They still do have a somewhat air raid philosophy. They try to be a little bit more balanced. One of the reasons I'm encouraged that Oregon's run defense was so strong against BYU, because the Cougars only scored 17 points against Wisconsin, which is the best barometer for, what to expect from Washington State this week. But they didn't run the ball well in that game, and Cam Ward was not the player that they're kind of hoping he is. Now, maybe he makes that leap this week, and he showed a little more of that with some impressive throws against Colorado State a week ago. But thus far, he has, I would say, not been much of an upgrade, maybe even a little bit of a downgrade from Jaden Delora from a season ago. And they brought him in because they thought he and his offensive coordinator, formerly head coach at Incarnate Ward, Eric Morris, would be an upgrade in that sense. But so far, the offensive results have been pretty middling, but they're 3-0 because their defense is fast, they're physical, and they're well coached, and they create havoc too. They create a lot of havoc in that Wisconsin game, as I'll talk about and get to more on Oregon and their defensive front a little bit. But I want to remind you that these days every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. You can go to LinkedIn, post your job, then add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and ultimately hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires against leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Locked on college. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So this defensive front for Oregon is not a unit that's gotten a lot of pass rush so far, but they've been very good against the run. And one reason that is giving me confidence against this Washington State team is Wisconsin's the best barometer for what to expect, and the Cougars only scored 17 points. Right now, if you told me that Oregon holds Washington State to 17 points, I think they're winning that game pretty comfortably because the Badgers only managed 14 points at home, but I think Oregon's offense is a step above Wisconsin's right now in 2022, and typically they haven't been the most explosive team. Like it was a good matchup for Washington State. They took advantage. They made plays when they needed to. The Badgers still could have won the game, but they played them relatively even. At least on the scoreboard, the box score was slanted more towards the Badgers. But if this Oregon defensive front can play against Washington State like they did against BYU, stopping the run, it'll force them to go to the air with Cam Ward, who's capable of slinging it around. He threw the ball a lot in his previous stop at Incarnate Ward for a couple years at the FCS level. And we know, right? We saw Vernon Adams. That transition can be made, but we also saw Dakota Prukop. Sometimes that transition is a little bit of a struggle. Right now, the results on Cam Ward kind of in between. There's been some good, but there's been some, what exactly was that? But in watching him, the moments when he struggles and when he's thrown interceptions this year, and he threw two in that game in Madison against the Badgers, he's been under pressure. And that's why, again, just like last week with Jaron Hall, I'm concerned about getting pressure because so far, that's when you've been able to force him into mistakes at this point in his college career. It is when you're able to have a free rusher or able to, win a 1v1. And that's where guys like Brandon Dorlus and DJ Johnson and Mase Funa at some point have got to step up, right? Like the potential is there. None of them have been elite pass rushers consistently, but for a game or two, a guy like DJ Johnson, who I think is just continuing to get better, right? I was singing his praises in the run game. I'm waiting for him to pop in the passing game. I really think that he can do that. He's capable of doing it, and he doesn't necessarily need to get on the stat sheet and record a sack, but he needs to be able to create pressure and make Cam Ward uncomfortable because he's had a tendency to try and extend plays, to break contain or get kind of flustered in the pocket when the pressure does come. And I think that could be a really advantageous situation for Oregon's defense if they're able to create some pressure there. But the run defense couldn't have been much better against BYU. So even if that's the case, right? Let's say it's kind of a repeat of what Oregon did defensively last week. I don't think Washington State will get to 20 points because I think BYU has got a better quarterback, though comparable for sure. But I think Jaron Hall's more experienced, which he is at the FBS level, and is more physically gifted than Cam Ward by a little bit, and has probably got the receiving targets are probably comparable. But if Oregon's defense plays the way that it did on Saturday, I love our chances to win. Absolutely love it because the secondary showed up really well because there was not constant pressure on Jaron Hall, which was a concern of mine. But the secondary, to their credit, I thought played an exceptional game. And I think the Cougars philosophically ran into, kind of a situation where they were overthinking it a bit and wanting to run the ball and wanting to be balanced. And you see that with defensive head coaches pretty often, they can get stubborn in wanting to establish the run. If I'd been BYU, I would have watched the first quarter and a half, seen how the Cougars were running the ball, which was not very effectively, and said, okay, we're going to be like 65-35 throwing plays versus running plays. I wonder if Washington State will watch the film and say, boy, Noah Sewell is really good. Dorlus and Casey Rogers and DJ Johnson and Justin Flo should be back. He's been back at practice. So has Stephen Jones, I believe, and Byron Cardwell. Actually, Jones, I'm not sure. Cardwell, yes, he had a sleeve on, but other than that, he's back at practice. Flo is there. So if you're Washington State, you got to look at the Georgia model, right? You want to look at how Oregon's defense was exploited, and that's throwing the ball more often. And I wonder if that won't be part of what they're looking to do in this particular game. The second thing, though, the secondary played well. The secondary did not have an interception, but Trikweze Bridges had a great pass breakup in the end zone. Christian Gonzalez, my man, Gonzo, is really good. He looks like a true number one corner for the Ducks, and that's exactly what they need when you have an offseason in which Mikael Wright and DJ James decide to go elsewhere to the NFL and Auburn, respectively. I'd rather be at Oregon than Auburn right now, but that's neither here nor there. I think that when you look at the way the secondary played, it surpassed my expectations. There were still moments where it looked a little iffy, but you have to remember, you're never going to have perfect coverage all the time. And given that Jaron Hall was only sacked once and was not really under a lot of pressure throughout the course of the game, I don't know how much better the secondary could have played. I really don't. Now, the concern that some fans have, understandably so, is the number two corner slot. And that's the other thing that has me mildly worried, right? I'm definitely more encouraged based on how they performed a week ago. Like the pass rush wasn't there. The number two corner slot was clearly a weakness, but those are the weaknesses of the defense. I don't see anything else there, right? The safeties overall played pretty well. I'm not worried about that touchdown call. That was a great play call and well executed by BYU. That was the first thing I said when I watched it. I was like, oh, that was a great play call. Like, offenses have the advantage in football. You're not going to get a perfect scorecard defensively. It's just not going to happen. But if they can replicate the model that Wisconsin was able to do in that game a couple weeks ago and make Washington State throw the ball more, which is not it's not exactly an air raid system. It's kind of a hybrid. They want to run it a little bit more, but you hold the Cougars under 20 points, you're going to be in a really good slot. But the number two corner, I think, in this game and beyond, is going to be a continuing question mark because Trikweze Bridges got burned on the first play of the game. Now, was it great? Was it confidence boosting? No. However, that was a heck of a throw and catch. That's always important to remember, right? People may only remember like, oh, he got beat for this, he got beat for that. Well, how did he get beat? That was a 35-yard back shoulder dart that was completed about 20 yards down the field. Was he in great position? No. But was he in a terrible position? Not really. It's just a good throw and catch, and a back shoulder is really, really tough to stop. And I agree that Bridges was picked on more than Christian Gonzalez, who I don't know if he allowed a reception in one-on-one man coverage against BYU. He might have at some point, but he certainly wasn't beat. And he looks he looks like an NFL corner. It is what he looks like, which is awesome because that's what Oregon needs. But for Bridges, I didn't think he played horribly, but I also thought that it was telling that the staff put Dante Manning and Jaleel Florence in there at different points throughout the game because he was struggling relative to Gonzalez. But the other thing to factor in is Triquest Bridges also came back later and saved the touchdown. And actually, it was kind of a turning point in the game. He's one-on-one man coverage on a slot fade. Hall throws a good ball, receiver gets his hands on it, and Bridges punches it out. That leads to a missed field goal and an Oregon touchdown, and we lead 17-7 instead of yeah, is that right? Yeah, because it was 17-7. No, it was 17-7 at the time. They missed that field goal. We go down, scores 24-10 going into the half. That was crucial. Absolutely crucial, right? Because they didn't get any points on that possession, and that was thanks to Triqueze Bridges. And I point that out to just say that everyone's going to be harping on him, and I get it because he's clearly the weaker of the two corners, but he still does some good things, though I will say it's got to be tough for him. He seems to have been going back and forth, safety corner, safety corner. The last coaching staff was moving him around, and he was recruited as a safety, played corner last year, but then he was going to move. And it just feels like it's got to be tougher for a guy to get a feel for all the movements and the play calls and everything that goes into playing a given position when you're constantly going back and forth. I think he's doing all right. Would I be surprised if Dante Manning is starting on Saturday instead of him, or if Manning comes in sooner rather than later in the game? No. But I also won't be shocked if Bridges is out there. And I'll tell you why. There's one more reason we all need to remember after I remind you about our friends at Bet Online, the number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, including the Ducks at Washington State, news and podcasts BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including Major League Baseball. Always repping. Go Mariners. MMA, boxing, my personal favorite, golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline is where the game starts. So with Bridges and Manning, because I think there's a contingent of Duck fans out there that would like to see Dante Manning because he's a highly rated recruit. He's the most physically gifted of the bunch, and the light just hasn't gone on in his head yet, right? It just has not clicked for him, and he hasn't been the player we thought he could be when he committed to and came to the University of Oregon to play defensive back. His ceiling, yes, is the highest at the position of anybody who was there. He's also in his third year of college football, 2.5, but because 2020 is whatever. But I think that what we have to remember is if you go out there, if you're hoping to see Dante Manning, who I thought had a good game, got called for a bogus pass interference, had a couple of nice coverage moments, made a couple tackles. I thought he had a nice game. If you're hoping to see him start in Pullman on Saturday, but instead it's Trikweze Bridges, what you have to remember is this. We all see the games. We can come on here, break them down, talk about them as I've been doing all throughout this podcast, individual performances and such. The coaches watch all that too, and they get to watch practice all week. So if Triquez, and I'm not saying I don't want to see Dante ever on the field again because I'd like to see him have the opportunity to get to his potential, but he's got to earn it. Because if the coaching staff went through fall camp and has seen the 3 games Oregon has played so far, and then goes through practice this week and says Triquez is going to be the best corner that Oregon can put out there across from Christian Gonzalez, then that's what Oregon has to do. And that's the best move for the Ducks. So I think given that it sounds like it's a negative, it's a weakness, and it is a weakness of the defense, but that's relative to a defense that just allowed 7 points through 3 quarters against the then 12th ranked team in the country with an NFL caliber quarterback. So everything's got to be taken with a grain of salt, and you got to have some context when you're talking about, well, this guy's not as good as the other one. Well, I don't know if Oregon's had a corner as good as Christian Gonzalez since maybe probably Thomas Graham. Well, I was always a Mikhail Wright fan, but I think he took a step back last year, could have benefited from coming back. And Mikhail would certainly start opposite Gonzo this year, and that would have been a pretty lethal combo, I think. But when you have an NFL caliber corner on the other side, it's not always fair to compare the guy who's starting to the other guy because not everybody who plays and is a good college football player has NFL potential the way that someone like Christian Gonzalez does, at least in my personal view. Let's wrap up with this. This question comes from the YouTube comments, which is one of 4 ways you get a question answered here on the show. Tweet the hashtag AskLODPod or just DM me at smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks or at me on Twitter. YouTube comments work as well. This one comes from LFBP Fishing, who I saw earlier tonight on a live stream with Ryan Winter, who was on Monday's show this week. He asks, great show, Spencer. Thank you. A question. What are your keys to success going up to Wazoo? And give us a score prediction. My prediction is Oregon 35, Washington State 27. I think this game will be more competitive than BYU defensive showdown. 35-27, high scoring defensive showdown. All right. And then he closes it with go Ducks. So I'm going to hold off on a score prediction here until Friday's show, which I'm going to record with Max Torres. Once I can dive deep into the matchup, I'll get you that there. But the biggest thing, and I was looking especially at the Wisconsin game, because much like with Oregon, there's only one game on Washington State's schedule that's a good barometer to understand what this team is. And for Oregon, it's BYU. And for Washington State, it's that game against Wisconsin. And the Badgers lost that game. Washington State deserves credit. They forced turnovers. They did just enough offensively. They didn't let the Badgers pull away, even though they were down at the half. I think it was 14-7. They did not allow Wisconsin to score in the second half. That is some tremendous defense. It was also kind of poor execution on Wisconsin's part. The Badgers had just over 400 yards of offense and only managed 14 points at home. The biggest thing for Oregon in this game is to not beat yourselves. Wisconsin arguably should have won that game. They didn't, and the Cougars deserve credit. But when you go into the details of that one, what you see is a game that frankly was dominated by Wisconsin for the most part, except for the mistakes that Washington State caused, and Wisconsin also had some self-inflicted wounds. They had 3 turnovers. They picked off Cam Ward, then they fumbled after the interception to give it back to Washington State, so they never lost possession and actually got a new set of downs. They had 11 penalties for 105 yards. Wisconsin did. They shanked a field goal. The game could have gone to overtime, but it looked like it was blocked. Nope, kicker just struck it right in the middle of the ball and just knuckle shanked it. They threw an interception in the red zone at the 9-yard line, down 3 points with 6:50 to go on a ball that shouldn't have been thrown because Graham Mertz didn't have the pocket presence to step up into the pocket where it was cleanly created by his offensive line. But that mistake was on him, and Ron Stone Jr., who's Washington State's best defensive player, who comes off the edge, hit his arm, and a defensive lineman picked it off. But then the defensive lineman picked it off, and then Wisconsin punched it free from him, recovered the ball, and the Badgers had it back. And then they get a completion to a tight end. He's running inside the 20, and it's punched free from behind. Washington State recovers with about 5 minutes to go, and they end up running out the clock. And on that drive where Washington State ran it out and ultimately won the game, there's a 3rd and 2. A 3rd and 2 on Washington State's own side of the field. They don't get it. They're going to punt the ball away, right? It was too deep in their own territory. Cam Ward drops the ball, trying to hand it off to the running back, picks it up, still gets his way across the first down line to gain to move the sticks on what was a broken play. But Wisconsin in that situation had a defensive play calling mishap, in my view. It's 3rd and 2, and they had 5 guys in the box. Washington State had Cam Ward and their running back, who's a Wisconsin transfer, who is a good player, and Oregon should have the attention, or he should have Oregon's attention rather, because he's a good player, former 3-star guy, just like rock solid running back, replacing McIntosh and Max Borghi from last year. Wisconsin puts 5 guys in the box against 5 offensive linemen. And the Cougars go 2 by 2. They stack 2 over here and they stack 2 over there. And Wisconsin's got 2 guys out there. And then they're playing like 2 deep safeties on 3rd and 2. I'm like, what are you doing? They're just trying to move the sticks. They're going to keep this on the ground, keep the clock running, and punt it if they don't convert because they trust their defense that's been making plays all game long. So the biggest key that I have for Oregon, don't beat yourself. If another guy makes a great play and forces a turnover, that's one thing. That's what happened on Wisconsin's last fumble. Penalties, turnovers, bad play calls, a shanked field goal, all that sort of stuff added up to a Wisconsin loss and a game they easily could have won. And if Oregon's defense forces Cam Ward to throw the ball a lot, which he hasn't had a ton of success doing so far, if they force him to do that and keep Washington State, I'm getting everybody mixed up right now. Probably means the show should come to an end, which it's about to. If they can keep Washington State from running the ball and having a balanced offensive attack, that is where the Cougars offense was struggling. A week ago against Colorado State, they had much more success on the ground. I think they want to be more balanced. But if the defense plays the way it did against BYU and you don't beat yourselves, I think Oregon has got a great chance to go into Pullman and start Pac-12 play 1-0. Mercifully, that'll do it for today. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.